It does not seem to Americans that there was ever a moment after the election of Abraham Lincoln when the Civil War could have been averted. It appears to have been absolutely inevitable. Yet there was certainly one moment when, if President Buchanan had had the courage to apply the general views which he himself advanced in his annual message to Congress of December 3, 1860, and his special message of January 8, 1861, which explicitly denied the right of secession, a halt might have been called to the growing rebellion. The secession movement was at first concentrated in the state of South Carolina. That state, all through the winter of 1860, was presenting to the rest of the South an object lesson of successful nullification. In 1833 South Carolina had ordained nullification, but its ordinance was so instantly and heavily repressed by President Andrew Jackson that the state was absolutely unable to carry it out, or to move hand or foot. But now, in 1860, it did not merely ordain nullification, it enacted it. Every federal judge, every judicial servant, and nearly every federal official, in South Carolina, resigned, and the nation was left without an agent to enforce its laws, for no new ones were sent in. The United States authority in the state was at an end, save for the Custom House at Charleston and Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor. As long as South Carolina was let alone, her case plainly showed the other slave states that secession might not be crushed. At this time North Carolina and Virginia were opposed to secession. Governor Sam Houston of Texas stood like a rock against it. Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, never seceded. Other states were wavering. A great deal depended on the degree of success which South Carolina, the leader in the revolt, might have. And it was Buchanan who permitted South Carolina's success to become apparently complete, though in the message the president declared that secession was wholly inconsistent with the Constitution and no human power could absolve the president from his duty to enforce the laws. Buchanan, in his December message, actually quoted Jackson's solemn denunciation of the doctrine that a state had a right to separate itself from the Union. But while he was making these admissions of his own duty, what was Buchanan doing? Instead of holding up the hands of the nation's representatives in South Carolina, he was weakening them. Instead of strengthening the federal garrison in Charleston Harbor, he permitted it to dwindle until it was powerless to take a single step. Not one act did he perform, but contented himself with calling on Congress for legislation to meet the emergency. And out of Congress, of course, he could get nothing, for the Southern representatives would vote for no such legislation, and the Republican members were bent upon waiting until Lincoln, who had been elected president, came in March. So South Carolina went on proving to the other slave states that it could go it alone. One after another these other states seceded from the Union. Northern arsenals were stripped of arms. Southern officers went out of the army one by one, and made ready to organize the army of the new Confederacy which was forming under the president's nose. It was a time for the strong arm, and for quick, decisive, Jacksonian, and not at all squeamish, action. But no such action was taken. The golden moment was lost, and when, 3 months afterward, Lincoln came in at last, war, with all its horrors, was upon the country. If the young rebellion had been truly nipped in the bud, as it might have been, by a rigid enforcement, in November and December 1860 of federal judicial processes in South Carolina, if the laws of the United States had been enforced in that state at the point of the bayonet, if need be, if a federal functionary, sustained by an ample force of United States troops, had torn South Carolina's ordinance of secession into shreds on the steps of the Capitol at Columbia, is it likely that South Carolina's sister states would have been so prompt at seceding? Very likely it might not have been necessary to do any of these things. If Buchanan had merely stood up and said, as Jackson did in 1833, I shall enforce the laws of the United States in spite of any and all resistance that may be made, there might well have been no more of secession in 1860 or 1861 than there had been of real nullification in 1833. And if this step had been taken, and there had been no war, what then? What about slavery, it may be asked? Is it conceivable that Northern sentiment would have permitted chattel slavery to continue? Was not war inevitable on that main question alone? Without war, but with the southern states held within the Union, sentiment in the North would have been more favorable to a compromise which would have prevented the extension of slavery, and events would surely have brought about a gradual liberation of the blacks in the South, as events soon ended slavery in Brazil and Cuba. But there would have been no black suffrage. That was enforced by conditions which grew out of the war. The South would not have been impoverished, and it could have afforded exercise of the suffrage. There would have been no disturbing reversal of the position of the two races, to be followed by a violent restoration of white supremacy and an accompanying development of inveterate hostility between whites and blacks. And where, at Antietam, at Gettysburg, at Fredericksburg, and on many humbler fields where the flags wave over the even ranks of soldier graves, the birds would sing in thickets which the bullet's hiss and the shriek of the shell had never profaned, while their teeming populations of dead men would be entombed among their loved ones after lives of peaceful usefulness.